All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Jake Shapiro, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton, and it's a distinct pleasure to introduce today's guest, Danny Rogers, co-founder, executive director, and CTO of the Global Disinformation Index. Danny is a physicist by training who, as he relates the story, and I'm sure he'll say more, was extremely frustrated several years ago with the fact that people were making a ton of money off various kinds of tendentious information online, and that was polluting the information ecosystem and damaging the potential for democratic discourse in our country. And unlike most of us who look at that problem and get really mad and then go home and don't do anything, Danny set out to solve it. And he has a particular theory of change that I think is fascinating and very excited to hear him talk about it today. So with that introduction, I'd like to turn it over to you, Danny. And thank you so much for joining us. We really look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Jake. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me here. It's truly an honor to get to brief such an esteemed company. And I just to sort of build on what Jake was saying, I am unfortunately a recovering physicist by training. My little Einstein doll is my last vestige of my homage to my physics background. Spent a number of years in the US intelligence community working on cyber and information operations. From there, left to start a private sector cybersecurity company called Terbium Labs that focused on dark web intelligence and data breach, stolen credit card kind of stuff. That's now part of Deloitte's cyber practice. And then, as Jake said, a few years ago, left the private sector to start this nonprofit organization called the Global Disinformation Index, which I'll tell you more about. We are focused mostly on the kind of financially motivated, we call the business model of disinformation, and I'll talk to you more about that. But again, just wanted to say I really appreciate the invitation and excited to talk to you all today. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share some slides here. Let's see. Great, and everyone can see that?
Looks great.
Awesome. So I want to be kind of rather stark at the outset here and say that we, in my view, are at a what I would call a watershed moment in the history of information. In some ways, the internet has been one of the greatest agents of free speech and democracy in the history of the world. Giving individuals and communities that have historically had less voice, more voice, really kind of upended the one-to-many model of communication, created new platforms for building communities, new ways to hold power accountable. And for many years, that was the sort of techno-idealism of the web. And then in the recent years, and when I teach this subject at NYU, there's sort of, we identify a sort of a point, right around the time that well, I'll get to what that point is, but where we kind of hit a crossroads, where that was the original intent, the original vision, the original beauty of the internet. But when the sort of other side of the technology enablement kind of reared its head. In terms of when that was, I kind of put it right around the time that Facebook went public. It was sort of a combination of, so I would call it around 2012. So Facebook went public around the same month, actually, that Putin was reelected. Well, I should put quotes around quote reelected. And in the ensuing weeks after that, essentially sham election in which there was very obvious, shall we say, cheating going on. The Bolotnaya Square protests ensued in Moscow, and it was sort of the first moment that Putin actually felt threatened by a mass movement. The sort of techniques that used to work of arresting, party leaders and things like that wasn't working just the way it had previously. And all these folks who were organizing were doing so in a very kind of decentralized, organic way on Facebook. And I think that kind of put the fear of God in him. In fact, many people have confirmed that he truly does believe that Facebook was the creation of the CIA solely to sort of dethrone him, so to speak. I think that's a bit paranoid, but I think it's clearly representative of the way he views the world, and I think he set out at that point to kind of figure out a way to destroy it, frankly. Like I said, in the meantime, Facebook had just had their IPO. There was sort of a big question, a big kind of exciting new moment for the tech community to say, wow, this sort of attention-driven social intermediating kind of economy based on ads, really how big is it? And I think the subsequent growth of Facebook really kind of has proven out their thesis from a business perspective, and then has turned into kind of the dominant business models that not only drive the internet, but that have supplanted energy companies as the largest businesses in the world, and thus led to some very serious externalities for society that I'll be talking about today. But if you ask me when this started, it was right around the middle of 2012 for that reason. And so if we continue here, the current state that we find ourselves in is not actually that kind of new in the understanding sense, that even dating back to 1970, Marshall McLuhan wrote about this concept of what he called World War III, a guerrilla information war with no division between military and civilian participation. If we look at what's happening, for just as one example, in kind of the border between Ukraine and Russia right now, we see that exact sort of model playing out. It's what military thinkers have called for a long time, this concept of fifth generation warfare. Fourth generation warfare being state on network, very much like the war on terror that we've been engaged in for the last 2 decades. Fifth generation really is network on network, sort of ad hoc, decentralized groups of folks that organize online, that are very hard to associate with any particular state actor, that kind of roll up all of us into these information combatants, very much like what we're all experiencing in the current culture wars. And then I'll talk more about how we define disinformation specifically and adversarial narratives in a moment. By the way, I should point out, I really enjoy a very informal kind of conversational format. So please, if you have comments, questions, I'm more than happy to be interrupted, and I would love to have a vigorous discussion with you all. So what is it that social media brings to the landscape, right? Disinformation in various forms has been around since the beginning of time. In my class, I talk a lot about the narrative of Antony and Cleopatra, which is entirely a fabricated narrative by Octavian to usurp power, and one that we still tell today, thousands of years later. So it's been around a long time, but something about social media is very different. And I think really what it comes down to is never before has the world had this kind of computational speed and scale of measuring and feeding over half the world's population at this point individualized versions of reality that play to their personal interests and biases, and thus has led to, as I said, over half the world's population now kind of occupying their own individualized realities that diverge from everyone else's, and in that environment, it's kind of no wonder that we can't agree on basic facts, things like the Earth is flat or the Earth is round, or et cetera, et cetera. So just kind of opening just as setting the stage for the seriousness about with which I think we should take the current kind of disinformation crisis. So I think, though, if we kind of take one step back and say, what is the most foundational piece of this? To me, the most foundational thing in working in disinformation is defining it in the first place. There's a lot of sort of relatively simplistic definitions out there, mostly around true and false. A lot of people kind of get caught up in the word disinformation versus the word misinformation, saying disinformation is someone intentionally spreading falsehoods, whereas misinformation is inadvertent. I kind of don't really find the semantic, kind of distinction particularly compelling. And I'll say the simplistic definition of somebody kind of intentionally spreading a lie on the internet has never really, for me, passed the most basic test, what I call the Santa Claus test, which is, if it really was about someone intentionally lying on the internet, we'd all be clamoring to deplatform Santa Claus from Facebook, and we're clearly not. And at the same time, there are plenty of people out there who engage in disinformation while never actually telling a single technical lie. And we'll talk about some examples of that in just a moment. In fact, here's one of my favorites. Breitbart News famously has this section of their website called Crimes by Illegal Aliens. It actually used to be just called Crimes by Immigrants. I don't know if they still have that, or you can find it somewhere. But essentially what it is a collection of technically true, local news stories about crimes that happen to be committed by people who were immigrants, or in this case, undocumented immigrants. And each one of these stories would technically fact check to be correct. And yet we all recognize this outlet and this particular technique as some kind of form of disinformation, even if we're not entirely sure how to put our finger on it. But it really does serve us as a more useful example around which we can build a useful definition of disinformation that goes beyond the simple true-false dichotomy. So how do we at GDI define disinformation? So we look at disinformation through the lens of what we call adversarial narrative conflict, getting back to that sort of fifth generation warfare approach to the problem. Adversarial narratives can be implicit or explicit, right? They don't have to literally say, immigrants commit crimes. They can simply show you a series of cherry-picked elements of the truth and imply a narrative that is itself adversarial. And most of the more effective adversarial narratives are implicit when actually instantiated. So anywhere where somebody is peddling an intentionally misleading narrative, often either implicitly or explicitly, often fabricated using cherry-picked elements of the truth, combined sometimes with fabrications, etc. Again, emphasis on the intentionally misleading. More importantly, that narrative is adversarial in nature against some at-risk individual, group, or institution. And this is where we start to diverge from the Santa Claus test, where in the case of that Breitbart immigrant crime section, right, it's adversarial against immigrants. But it can be adversarial against science or medicine or a democratically elected government, et cetera. But that adversarial nature is really gets the part of the heart of the definition, right? Creating an in-group and an out-group, us versus them, setting up that kind of adversarial relationship, and then most importantly, creates a risk of harm. And in all of these adversarial narratives that we track, we can readily identify the expected risk of harm. Even if we go back to the Breitbart immigrant crime section, that's clearly the kind of content that feeds anti-immigrant violence and hate crimes, et cetera. And so anywhere you have these elements, intentionally misleading narratives, implicit or explicit, often created using cherry-picked elements of the truth, but that are adversarial in nature against an at-risk group and individual institution and create a risk of harm, that is disinformation as we define it at the GDI. The beauty of it to us is that it captures all of these kind of sort of things that we intuitively understand as disinformation. It transcends this sort of morass of arguing over this piece of this story is true, or this headline is true or false, et cetera. And we can actually identify these narratives by their labels of, against whom they're adversarial. So anti-immigrant narratives, anti-vax narratives, misogynistic narratives, et cetera. All of that really helps circumvent a lot of the exhausting arguments over what I consider kind of semantics or nitpicking that often mire the conversation, and in fact are often the goal of those peddling the disinformation.
So,
and yeah, please. It's a great.
So I want to ask a question and also remind people that if you have a question, you want to jump in, please use the raise hand function. I'm monitoring the participant list so that if someone has an urgent question, I can call on you. But the big question for me on this, Danny, is this seems like very subjective, because this would also identify in some ways like a huge share of politics.
So,
how do you and the team think about drawing the line between what's like a legitimate adversarial narrative and one that you identify as being disinformation?
Sure. I mean, the way we think about it internally is a little bit of the concept of kind of, I mean, it really comes down to this at-risk kind of piece of the definition, right? And I sort of think about it, sort of heuristically as the punching up test. If we're talking about, sure, there can be adversarial relationships between an authoritarian government and an at-risk population, but it's where you put that risk, and it's where you put that power structure. And I think it's certainly like I will be the first to admit I am not a deeply trained political scientist. I'm you all are undoubtedly more expert than me at this, and I would love further ways we can refine this definition to handle various cases. I'll tell you, we, being an organization that operates all over the world, we have trouble navigating our own definition in various conflict zones where we're not fully, versed in the history of the particular conflict or the particular nuances of the politics. I agree, there is always a political element to, not always, but there's often a political element to this. We are a strictly neutral organization, and I don't mean for this to be about our organization, but I'll just give you as an example of how we think about it. One of our pillars as our organization is that we're strictly politically neutral. But one thing we aren't neutral about is disinformation, is somebody intentionally misleading, using a narrative that's adversarial against an at-risk group that creates a risk of harm. Those elements to us we're not neutral against. And so I sort of hear that, but I have yet to come up with a scenario where we have found ourselves, truly at a loss to kind of navigate through, even with all the information that we are able to gather. Does that, I don't know, I hope that's a satisfying answer. I'm not sure that it feels like I've satisfied the question myself, but I guess.
No, it is. I think will be great to see more of how you're operating, and then maybe during the discussion we can talk about how one would scale this assessment, or if doing so is even important, because there are a finite number of like very high salience political issues that are out in the world at any given point in time.
Sure. And again, we are, at the end of the day, we are not a think tank, even though some people like to put us in that box, but we are what I call a data-driven advocacy organization. And so we have actually like very pragmatic ways that we seek to instantiate this to have an impact on the sort of obvious problems in front of us. And like I said, we do at times, find ourselves having to sort of gingerly navigate conflict zones and things like that. We're operating in Ukraine at the moment, and even beyond just sort of personnel safety is how do we not navigate the political situation. I think we have a very clear sense of which population is at risk in that particular conflict, but generally speaking, that is certainly something that we have continuously ongoing discussions about. So this is the best definition we've been able to come up with, but I'm always open to constructive improvements on it. To give you some more obvious examples, and some of these, like the one on the left, we've literally been in long drawn out legal exchanges with this particular publication over this exact headlines like this one and many like it. But you can see where Breitbart's lawyers, have and would continue to come back to us and say, well, technically speaking, it's not disinformation or what they might call fake news because Giuliani did really say this thing, right? And we would point out that because you're quoting Giuliani and not immediately following with it, there's no evidence for, the claims that he's making. You're participating in this exact act that we described of cherry picking elements of the truth to spin an adversarial narrative that's anti-democratic and ultimately creates a risk of harm. Similarly on the right, which is a particularly notable, what we call a kind of far left publication, another sort of notorious peddler of what we define as disinformation, is giving us a very obviously biased and editorialized headline saying LA County Sheriff tells the truth about COVID vax mandates, when in fact, the LA County Sheriff did actually make a statement about them, but calling it the courageous truth is very obviously putting an editorial and an adversarial spin on it. So these are just sort of the examples of the kinds of things that we've built our definition around and to handle and to label. In terms of how we think about the disinformation threat landscape, we think about it in this sort of two-dimensional spectrum here. On the horizontal axis, we divide the world into sort of political or ideological motivations on one extreme, financial motivations on the other extreme. Obviously there's room in the middle, and many would argue these days with such strong economic incentives aligned to certain ideologies, can you really separate out whether someone is motivated by ideology or economics? And many behavioral economists would argue the answer is no. But certainly kind of a spectrum of motivations across that, and then a spectrum of organizational formats from highly centralized actors to highly decentralized actors. And some examples here in the blue, state actors are obviously highly politically motivated and highly centralized, whereas, grassroots troll armies, et cetera, are obviously, highly decentralized actors. Some of them are motivated purely by ideology, some, if you can count nihilism as an ideology. Some are motivated purely by the desire to make money through the monetization of audiences and the kind of dominant business model of the internet. And then of course in the top right we have the example of for hire, highly centralized and organized kind of dark PR operations, many call them, right? But the sort of Cambridge Analytica style, Black Cube style organizations of the world. And I'll tell one quick anecdote about that quadrant. In my class, when we discussed the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the homework for that week is for them to go out and find another company like Cambridge Analytica and write a quick, memo profiling them. Last time I did that assignment, it was absolutely fascinating because I have about a dozen students. Each one came back with a completely different company profile. And just no two were alike, all were currently operating. And it was just a great reminder of the fact that is a very vibrant, space right now for startup companies and organizations, et cetera. And that there is a robust ecosystem of influence operators out there under various monikers from communications, PR, risk management, et cetera, all kind of engaging in what we would describe as adversarial narrative conflict in one form or another. Again, any questions about this, any comments, reactions, please do feel free to raise a hand or interrupt. I'm not sure that we have time for this. It's 5:01 here in New York. I don't know, Jake, do we have a full hour? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think this example, maybe a quick show of hands, how many people have seen this clip, seen this study from a few years ago from PBS NewsHour profiling this gentleman, Cyrus Masumi? Is this new to people? Jake, do you think we can actually try to share this? I don't know if I can even share the audio here.
I think it's worth a shot. I'm seeing no raised hands, which tells me it's probably new to people. Or the audience is
probably worth it. Let's try it. Let's see what happens if I try it. If it doesn't try it, I'll describe it to you. But I just think it's so powerful coming from this guy to hear it from his own, through his own words. So give me one moment to pull it up here. All right, let's try sharing this. And if I share this, can I share? You can click share sound. Let's try it. Oh. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can't, there's no.
Hear me.
Well,
Let's see if this works.
A deep dive on the continuing problem of false or misleading news.
Perfect.
You can hear it. Great. All right. It's such a powerful interview that I feel like it's worth us spending 10 minutes, 9.5 minutes here to view it. So I'm going to hit play. Please feel free to interrupt or raise it if you have any questions.
Or what you might call junk news. Much of the attention recently has centered on Facebook. And yesterday, the company's founder and CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, told Wired magazine that it may take up to 3 years to fully prevent all kinds of harmful content from affecting people's news feeds. Tonight, Miles O'Brien's latest report profiles a man who has been a leading purveyor of junk news and how he has been exploiting Facebook to reach an audience. It's part of our weekly series on the leading edge of technology.
There has been a shooting at a high school in Parkland.
Right now we have about 5,300 people and change on the website.
It was a busy day at the office when we met one of the internet's most prolific distributors of hyper-partisan fare.
Actually, in a story like this, we do actually beat the mainstream media for these types of breaking news events.
It was the day of the high school shootings in Parkland, Florida. And as the horrific events unfolded, Cyrus Masumi was spinning facts reported by others to fit the worldview of his audience.
You can see that, like, he's wearing a Make America Great Again hat.
Right.
And he has lots of photos of guns, so obviously this is going to be a very controversial issue.
His site is called Truth Examiner, and it caters to liberals with headlines like this designed to entice clicks on stories with little substance. His writers are among the 5 most successful at luring those clicks on Facebook.
People want to read those lines to reaffirm their beliefs, right?
Correct.
And that is not rocket science, is it?
It's not rocket science, but doing it faster and better than your competitors is an art.
Lately, Truth Examiner has added something else to the formula, a steady stream of conspiracy theories, ironically accusing the Trump administration of peddling fake news. Masumi has thrived in this murky world for 8 years, hedging his bets, serving up grist for liberals and conservative Facebook pages.
They want like 250 word, like little hit them and go. It's like basically like a coke addict. Every hour, he just needs to, like, you know, get that little dopamine rush. So take out their phone, look at it. Oh, Trump sucks. Trump sucks so bad. All right, I'm done. And then, right? Like, that's it. That's it.
People don't care about the facts.
Yeah, of course. People don't care about facts. Take it to the bank.
He estimates he has spent over $1 million in ads, reaching over 100 million people, and has made several $1 million by selling that audience to advertisers on his own site and on Facebook.
Do you create fake news?
No, I don't.
Tell me what it is then.
Always inflammatory, like excluding facts from the other side, but never fake. My team, they don't cover news angles which are favorable to opposition in the same way that CNN would never cover a favorable angle to Trump, or MSNBC.
He lives in the home where he grew up, on a 9-acre vineyard in Napa, California.
We grow a brand of Cabernet, which is, I'm told, very nice, although I'm not a wine person.
He is a self-described cultural libertarian, free thinker, and lover of politics. For him, it all started in high school. He was selling anti-Obama t-shirts and decided Facebook was a good way to reach more customers. It worked. He learned how to build an audience on Facebook, dropped the t-shirts, and created Mr. Conservative, his first hyper-partisan site.
So I'm a marketer with a love of politics. And, I contend that marketers will be the king of the future of media. I think that the danger is not the Russians or the Macedonians, but that the actual danger is when you have a marketer who doesn't love politics.
Producer Cameron Hickey found Cyrus Masumi during our 16-month investigation of hyper-partisan misinformation on Facebook. Cameron's key reporting tool, software that he wrote that analyzes social media, looking for the sources of what we call junk news.
It's clear that a lot of the publishers are domestic, and I think we've given a lot of attention to Russian disinformation or Macedonian teenage profiteers, but both of those groups, I think, learned it from these guys. They learned it from Americans who have been long profiting on partisan information or other kinds of junk.
Social networking allows us all to bypass the traditional arbiters of truth that evolved in the 20th century.
Historically, our information landscape has been tribal. We turn to the people that are like us, the people that we know, the people around us, to make sense of what is real and what we believe in.
Computer scientist Dana Boyd is president and founder of Data and Society.
And what we're seeing now with a networked media landscape is the ability to move back towards extreme tribalism. And there are a whole variety of actors, state actors, non-state actors, who are happy to move along a path where people are actually not putting their faith in institutions or information intermediaries, and are instead turning to their tribes, to their communities.
Cyrus Masumi's first big jackpot exploiting this trend toward tribalism was linked to yet another mass shooting at a school, this one in Sandy Hook, Connecticut in 2012. In the midst of that horror, he bought a Facebook ad that asked the question, "Do you stand against the assault weapons ban? If so, click like." Those who did became subscribers to his page, ensuring his content would rise to the top of their news feeds. He had bought thousands of fans at a very low price.
I felt subsequently that I built my first business, sort of, if you want to call it, on the graves of young children who were killed.
Well, how do you feel about that?
I don't know, how do people feel about things that they do badly? I feel bad about it, but I mean, we do what we do to pay the mortgage, right?
The strategy Masumi helped pioneer spread like virtual wildfire. By 2016, marketers, political operatives, and state actors were all using the same playbook of hyped headlines, political propaganda, and outright falsehoods.
They were all and set of rules when they saw a reality TV star start to run for president. And that's pretty funny. That's pretty interesting. And so it was fun to create spectacle.
The stage was set for the 2016 presidential election, and an unprecedented misinformation campaign waged on several fronts. Back in Napa, Cyrus Masumi was doing well, running a conservative page called Truth Monitor, along with the liberal Truth Examiner. Masumi says anger is what generates likes, and conservative stories were more lucrative.
Conservatives are angrier people.
Tell me about that.
You ever seen a Trump rally on TV?
Yes.
Yeah? It's gold.
But since the election, the conservative side of Masumi's business has dried up. His site that used to offer that content has moved into feel-good stories. He says competition among conservative hyper-partisans created a junk news arms race, making the content too extreme to be ranked favorably by the Facebook newsfeed algorithm.
On the conservative side, I think that we were at one point publishing low-quality clickbait. That's what the conservative side devolved into.
Is it unpatriotic to do it?
To publish low-quality clickbait? I think that people like what they like. And my goal at one point was to deliver to them what they like. And unfortunately, The reality of that is that people are prone to go for the lowest common denominator.
But for Cyrus Masumi, the target really doesn't matter, so long as he hits the mark. Stirring up anger, no matter on which side, is very good for business. Ahead, as we continue our series, you'll meet two of the fans bought by Cyrus Masumi, a deep blue liberal from Brooklyn and a Christian conservative from Indianapolis. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Miles O'Brien in Napa, California.
So the reason I shared that with you and used a few minutes of my time here is because I've always felt there's no better way to illustrate the kinds of threat actors in that part of the threat space than just hear it from their own mouths. And Cyrus Masumi has always been a great example of that, and someone who was very forthcoming about his business model. The thing I want to emphasize in kind of the wake of his own words is to say that in our view, and I think the thing that has happened since 2018 that has really put it into relief is that the harm from this kind of activity is very, very real. And I would point you all to a paper from a couple of years ago, well, about a year and change ago, by an economist out of Zurich named David Yanakazawa-Drought, entitled Misinformation in a Pandemic in the National Bureau of Economic Research, which really kind of hammered home the harm caused by online disinformation, or actually by disinformation in general. In that paper, he followed, actually was not even kind of viewers of Fox News and viewers of CNN, but actually viewers of Tucker Carlson's show versus viewers of Sean Hannity's show on Fox News at the outset of the pandemic, and demonstrated robust and statistically significant causal relationships between which show they watched and how seriously each of those shows took the pandemic at the outset, and the health outcomes from each of those populations. With, like I said, a very, very clear causal relationship between people's information diets and whether they got sick and whether they succumbed to COVID-19 in the early days. So the harm is very, very, very real, and we're still experiencing it today. With, I think, what most people agree is the continuing headwind against further vaccination efforts, really entirely the product of anti-vaccine disinformation. So in terms of how to combat it, and the sort of landscape out of which we started our own nonprofit, as I said, fact checking is not enough. Often exacerbates the problem, and really kind of inadvertently helps to amplify various adversarial narratives. There's obviously a chasm of mistrust between governments and private entities like tech platforms, et cetera, with really kind of a no clear center of responsibility. I think that's changing as we even heard in 2018, Mr. Masumi describing his activity. Throughout his entire description of it, you could keep hearing the power and the importance of making it to the top of the Facebook newsfeed. So I think that obviously kind of indicates where there's a clear center of power and responsibility in all of this. We believe that commercially driven efforts to combat this, will always face a tension between this business model, this clearly such lucrative business models as the attention-driven economy, and also kind of feel that most solutions don't scale. So what we've done at GDI, at least, is develop essentially an independent, neutral, transparent, not-for-profit with a variety of supporters from around the world and across the political landscape, focused on being truly apolitical and neutral, but with a focus on catalyzing change within the tech industry to change these perverse incentives and be transparent as we do it. in terms of the broader intervention points that we've identified, we think they fall into really three broad categories. One is the larger investment in media literacy, understanding this phenomenon, the role that modern social media plays in shaping reality, training people to better understand the way ads are targeted online and the whole tech ecosystem and what media looks like these days. There are organizations like First Draft News, which is focused on training journalists, the Disinformation Project, which is a new effort in the DC area focused on high school students. I've even always said, I was excited last year to see the AARP getting involved in media literacy training among the elderly, et cetera. Platform level interventions, really where we live, is around both kind of public and behind the scenes, as well as the larger regulatory and tech reform efforts around changing the media platform on which all of this occurs. This effect at the end of the day, the disinformation kind of phenomenon is, in my view, a toxic externality of the dominant attention-driven business models that drive the modern internet. And so, there's the individual sort of whack-a-mole kind of things that we can do on the trust and safety side that are being done every day at various levels. But there's also the broader tech reform things that I'll talk about in a moment. There's a number of NGOs operating, both more behind the scenes like we do, as well as very publicly, like the Center for Countering Digital Hate, the Sleeping Giants movement on Twitter, if you're familiar with that, the folks at Check My Ads, et cetera, all focusing on various levels of platform intervention. And then to me, there's the third category of what I call, counter messaging, or the ground war of combating disinformation. There's groups like Reality Team out there focused on just buying up people's news feeds with counter messages, with why people should get vaccinated, et cetera. And now that's a concerted effort, they're starting to get real data on what works and what resonates among the kind of the swayable audiences, right? Obviously, there's the category of people who are gonna put hashtag MAGA on their headstones, and we're not going to ever reach them. But there's a whole category of people who are kind of in the middle and kind of succumbing to the fact that these attention-driven news feeds naturally surface more adversarial and more anger-inducing content, and thus having to fight back with buying up that space to counteract that tailwind that the opposition has, so to speak. And so I think this is an emerging and incredibly important kind of category of intervention that will kind of get us to that future, that I hope we can get to, so to speak. In terms of, so these are examples, by the way, of various, interventions here in those categories. This is a clip of the kinds of things that Reality Team is pushing out there. This was an announcement the other day that another organization, a commercial organization in our space, NewsGuard, has given away their browser extension to every school kid in America. This is a documentary made for French television that kind of exposed the grift that was the Gateway Pundit that ultimately catalyzed them getting kicked off of the Google ad network. It's a big development for us this past year. I'm actually in the first 30 seconds of this documentary. But more towards that middle category and the larger kind of policy interventions, because to me, the biggest levers that can change this situation now, while the rest of us are kind of working around the edges, exist in Washington. And say what you will about the pragmatic prospects of these various things happening, but in my view, tech reform, the broader tech reform conversation is probably the most important piece of the conversation in terms of combating disinformation, really in three areas. Antitrust enforcement, we've found being out in the market that most folks in digital advertising would love to make sure that they're not funding anti-vax disinformation. It's actually not that big a problem relative to the size of the internet. Right now, our list that we create really identifies only about 1,500 websites total that are the overwhelming bulk of the problem. But because these advertisers have so little say, because of this sort of perverse market structure of digital advertising, really kind of nothing actually gets done. And so, in our view, creating a more robust market structure in digital advertising is a big part of creating an environment where we can solve the problem. Privacy regulation is the second category. Not only is personal data the fuel that feeds this sort of algorithmic fire, so to speak, this distortion engine that we all live in, but targeted advertising, and this is a more nuanced point, has actually robbed quality journalistic publications of their most important, monetizable asset, which is their audience. Right. That if you follow the work of folks like Dr. Johnny Ryan out of Ireland, he describes how the sort of mass transmission of personal information about audiences has really led to a scenario where even publications with such outsized readership as BuzzFeed can't support news staff anymore, because the folks that control the pipe have taken over the details of the asset in the private information. And so privacy regulation actually has a sort of a surprising surprisingly positive impact on the practice of journalism as well. And finally, and the issue that's most near and dear to my heart is platform liability reform. In my view, the current tech industry as we know it, the fact that these business models have become so historically outsized, is in large part because they benefit from this kind of ahistoric blanket liability waiver in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And I realize, especially among this audience, this is probably a very contentious point and one we could probably spend many more hours debating. But to me, every other industry in the world has at the very least a basic kind of mens rea standard for liability when it comes to the harm caused by their products. And that's something that platforms like YouTube and Facebook, et cetera, have been carved out from. And thus, even when they know explicitly that their algorithms or their recommendation engines are aiding genocide or accelerating or causing harm to teenage girls or helping recruit white supremacists, et cetera, there's literally no legal remedy, as there would be with literally any other industry. And so that legal immunity has given them kind of outsized power and thus allowed for these outsized growth. So there are proposals percolating around the halls of Congress now to revise that, but they're still in early stages, and I think that will be a huge part of rebalancing the scales, so to speak. But again, I realize I'm kind of lobbing a Molotov cocktail into the conversation with that one. So with that, obviously we're aware of a number of the global policy efforts, from the antitrust suits in Texas, the online safety bill in the UK, the digital media laws in Australia, the DSA in EU, and as I said, some of these emerging 230 reforms. These are all very nascent, and we continue to be involved in them. So I realized I put a whole lot on your plate.
So we're at our time. I would encourage folks to continue the conversation. If you have specific questions for Danny, he's nicely put his information there. And I would just say, we're going to be working over the next year to scope out a new institution to tackle a different piece of this problem than what Danny is going after. So if you're seized by the problem and convinced that they have identified an important niche and are interested in other niches or possibly exploring them, please reach out to me and we can talk more. Danny, thank you so much for your time today. This was awesome.
Thank you so much, and really enjoyed the discussion. Please do feel free to shoot me an email anytime, and we'll love to engage more on this. So thank you for having me.